Ethan Sinclair had built an empire, but wealth couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. Disguising himself as a man with nothing, he sought the truth. Who would show kindness to a stranger? When a storm led him to the Carter family, their generosity changed everything. But would his secret ruin it all? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. After hanging up, Ethan walked to his private elevator. The ride down 60 floors gave him time to remember how he got here. His father had built this empire from nothing, working 18-hour days, sacrificing everything for success. When he died 10 years ago, 28-year-old Ethan inherited it all. He'd spent the last decade making the company even bigger, more profitable. But what was it all worth? In the parking garage, he got into his Ferrari, one of 12 cars he owned. But instead of heading home to his empty mansion, he drove to Central Park. He parked the car and started walking. It was getting dark. The park was almost empty except for a few joggers and dog walkers. Nobody recognized him here. Nobody cared who he was or how much money he had. An old man sat on a bench, feeding pigeons. He smiled at Ethan, not because he was Ethan Sinclair, the billionaire, but just because he was another human being passing by. That's when the idea hit him. What if he could find out what people were really like? Not when they knew he was rich and powerful, but when they thought he was nobody. What if he could discover who would help a stranger with nothing to offer in return? Back in his office, Ethan made a few calls. He arranged for his trusted lawyer to handle things while he was gone. He had his secretary clear his schedule for the next month, citing a private retreat in Europe. Then he went to his private vault and took out the documents he'd prepared years ago. Papers that could transfer. His entire fortune with just a signature. He'd created them after his father died, thinking about legacy and what really mattered in life. Looking in the mirror of his private bathroom, Ethan studied his reflection. Designer suit, expensive haircut, manicured nails. Everything screamed wealth. He thought about the old man in the park, about how simple and genuine that smile had been. Time to find out what's real, he said to his reflection. He changed into the plainest clothes he could find. In his wall safe, he found the old leather notebook where he kept the transfer documents. He put it in his pocket, his only possession, worth anything. The storm was already gathering as he drove out of the city. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing thunder and lightning. Perfect weather for what he had in mind. By the time he reached the countryside, rain was pouring down. He parked his car in a small town, leaving the keys with a note for his lawyer to collect it. Then he started walking. The expensive shoes he wore weren't made for country roads. His clothes were soaked through in minutes. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by booming thunder. In the distance, he saw a light. A small farmhouse stood alone on a hill, looking worn down but somehow welcoming. Smoke rose from its chimney, promising warmth inside. Ethan Sinclair, the billionaire who had everything, stood in the rain looking at that humble house. For the first time in years, he felt something real. Hope mixed with fear. Would these people help him? Would they show kindness to a stranger with nothing to offer? He took a deep breath and walked up to the door. His hand shook slightly as he knocked. The door opened, and he saw her for the first time. Helen Carter, though he didn't know her name yet. Her face was tired but kind, her clothes simple but clean. Behind her, he caught a glimpse of her husband David and their children, all looking curiously at the stranger on their doorstep. "Please," Ethan said, his voice rougher than usual from the cold. "I need help." Those 4 words would change everything. "Come in, come in." Helen Carter stepped aside, letting the soaked stranger enter their small home. "David, get some towels." "Please." Ethan stepped inside, water dripping from his clothes onto the worn wooden floor. The warmth from the fireplace hit him immediately, along with the smell of soup cooking on the old stove. "Mom, who is he?" asked Jenny, the younger of the 2 Carter children. She was about 10, with pigtails and curious eyes. "Hush now," Helen said gently. "Let our guest get warm first." David returned with some old but clean towels. "Here you go, friend. The bathroom's down the hall if you want to dry off." Ethan took the towels, his hands shaking from the cold. "Thank you," he managed to say. In the small bathroom, Ethan looked around at the cracked tiles and peeling paint. The mirror was spotted with age, and the single light bulb cast a weak yellow glow. It was nothing like his marble bathroom at home with its golden fixtures and heated floors, but somehow this felt more real. When he came out, Helen had set an extra place at the dinner table. "You'll join us for dinner," she said. "It wasn't a question. I'm Helen, by the way. This is my husband, David, and our children, Jenny and Tom." Tom, who looked about 14, nodded shyly from his place by the fire. He was trying to fix what looked like a broken radio with a screwdriver that had seen better days. I'm John," Ethan said, using the fake name he'd planned. "John Smith. I don't want to impose—" "Nonsense," David said, pulling out a chair. "No one turns away a stranger in need. That's not how we were raised." Ethan sat down, watching as Helen served the soup. The bowls were chipped, the spoons mismatched, but everything was clean. He noticed how Helen served everyone else first, leaving the smallest portion for herself. "It's not much," she apologized. "Just vegetable soup and some bread." Ethan tasted the soup. It was simple but good, made with care and probably whatever vegetables they could afford. The bread was slightly stale, but it was all they had. "It's wonderful," he said, and meant it so, John, David said as they ate. "What brings you out here in weather like this?" Ethan had practiced his story. I lost everything. My job, my home. I was heading to the next town looking for work when the storm hit." "Times are hard," David nodded. "The factory in town closed last year. A lot of folks lost their jobs. I've been doing odd jobs, fixing things for people when I can." "David's good with his hands," Helen added proudly. "He can fix almost anything." "Except our luck," Tom muttered, still working on the radio. "Tom," Helen scolded gently. "We have what matters." Ethan looked around the room. Despite the poverty he saw everywhere, there were signs of love and care. Crayon drawings on the fridge, a handmade quilt on the couch, family photos on the wall, slightly faded but treasured. "The radio's hopeless, Dad," Tom sighed, putting down his tools. "We can't afford a new one." "We'll figure something out," David said. "We always do." After dinner, Helen started clearing the dishes. Ethan stood to help, but she shooed him away. "You're our guest. Rest." Jenny came up to him, holding a book. "Would you like to see my drawings? I want to be an artist someday." Ethan took the notebook. The pages were filled with colorful drawings, their house, their family, flowers, animals. Some pages were torn out, probably when they couldn't afford new paper. "These are beautiful," he said truthfully. "Jenny, homework time," Helen called. "School tomorrow." "But Mum, we don't have any paper left," Jenny said quietly. Helen's face fell slightly, but she covered it quickly. "Use the back of your old worksheets, honey." Ethan felt the weight of the leather notebook in his pocket, with its documents worth billions. These people had nothing, yet they'd shared everything they had with a stranger. "The storm's getting worse," David said, looking out the window. "You'll stay the night, of course." "I couldn't." Ethan started to protest. "We insist," Helen said firmly. "The couch isn't much, but it's better than being out there." Later, as the family prepared for bed, Ethan sat on the old couch, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. He could hear Helen and David talking quietly in their room. "I wish we could do more for him," Helen was saying. "You gave him our last bread," David replied softly. "Someone helped my family once, when I was little and times were hard. I never forgot that kindness." Ethan lay back on the couch, staring at the ceiling where water stains marked the spots where the roof leaked. In his mansion, he had 14 guest rooms, each with its own bathroom and TV, but he'd never slept in a place that felt more like a real home than this. The storm raged. Outside, but inside the Carters' humble home, Ethan Sinclair, pretending to be John Smith, felt a peace he hadn't known in years. These people had nothing to gain by helping him. They didn't know who he was. They just saw someone in need and opened their door, shared their food, offered shelter. Tom's broken radio sat on the table, a symbol of all the things this family needed but couldn't afford. Jenny's drawings showed talent that might never be developed without proper materials. The leaky roof, the cracked tiles, the empty pantry, all problems that could be solved with money. Money he had. Money that suddenly felt more like a responsibility than a privilege. As he drifted off to sleep, Ethan heard the wind howling outside, but it couldn't touch the warmth he felt inside. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find out more about this family. He needed to be sure, needed to understand them better, because if they proved to be as genuine as they seemed, he had the power to change their lives forever. But first, he had to be certain that money wouldn't change who they were at heart. Ethan woke to the sound of quiet activity in the kitchen. The storm had passed, but the morning air was cold. Through a crack in the living room curtains, he could see the sun wasn't up yet. "Sorry if we woke you," Helen whispered, noticing he was awake. She was making sandwiches at the kitchen counter. "We start early around here. The kids have to catch the school bus at 6:30, David explained, coming in from outside. His boots were muddy. "And I have to check the roof. That storm did some damage." Ethan sat up on the couch, his back stiff from the lumpy cushions. In his own bed, he slept on a mattress that cost more than this family probably made in a year. "Let me help," he offered. No, you're our guest," Helen started to say, but David interrupted. "Actually, I could use an extra pair of hands with the roof if you're willing." 20 minutes later, Ethan found himself on top of the Carter's house, holding a bucket of tar while David tried to patch the worst leaks. The morning air was crisp, and the countryside stretched out around them, beautiful despite its poverty. "Watch your step," David warned. "These old shingles are treacherous." Below, they could hear Helen getting the children ready for school. "Jenny, don't forget your science project is due today." "But Mom, I couldn't finish it. We ran out of glue, and—" "Here, use this instead." There was a pause. "It's not perfect, but it'll hold." Ethan heard the disappointment in Jenny's voice, saw the worry on David's face. Every parent wanted to give their children everything they needed. The Carters couldn't even afford school supplies. "The factory closing hit everyone hard," David said, spreading tar over a crack. 300 people lost their jobs. Some families moved away, but this is our home. Helen's parents left us this house. It's not much, but it's everything." Ethan finished, understanding. They worked in silence for a while. David, clearly, knew what he was doing, making repairs with whatever materials he could afford. But it was like putting a band-aid on a broken arm. It needed real fixing, not just patches. The school bus honked from the road. They watched as Helen hugged the children goodbye. Jenny's science project looked makeshift, held together with what appeared to be old string and determination. "Tom," Helen called, "you forgot your lunch." "It's okay, Mom," Tom said. "I'm not hungry anyway." But Ethan had seen Helen making only 2 sandwiches earlier. There wasn't enough food for everyone to have lunch. After the children left, Helen came outside with 2 cups of coffee. "It's instant," she apologized, handing them up. "We ran out of the real stuff last week." Ethan took the coffee. It was weak and bitter, but the warmth was welcome. In his office, he had a $3,000 espresso machine that he barely noticed anymore. "I should get going," David said, climbing down. "The Petersons need their fence fixed, and Mrs. Johnson's sink is leaking. Again." "How much do they pay you?" Ethan asked. David shrugged. "Whatever they can afford. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's vegetables from their garden or eggs from their chickens. You can't squeeze blood from a stone." Helen handed David a paper bag. "Here's your lunch." Ethan noticed she hadn't made anything for herself. "Will you be leaving too?" Helen asked Ethan after David had gone. I could help around here first," he offered. "To repay your kindness?" Helen smiled. "Well, I do need to go into town for groceries. Would you mind helping me carry them? It's a long walk." "You don't have a car?" "We did. Had to sell it last winter when Tom got sick. The medical bills." She trailed off, then brightened artificially. "But he's healthy now, and that's what matters." The walk to town took almost an hour. Helen knew everyone they passed, greeting them warmly. She told Ethan about the community, who was sick, who had lost their job, who was struggling to keep their farm. At the small grocery store, Ethan watched Helen shop carefully, counting every penny. She compared prices, chose the cheapest brands, put back things they clearly needed but couldn't afford. "Mrs. Carter," the store owner called out, "don't forget you can put it on your tab if you need to." "No, thank you, Mr. Wilson," Helen said firmly. We pay our way, but when she counted out her money at the register, she was short by a few dollars. Red-faced, she started to put back the children's favorite cereal. "Please," Ethan said quietly. "Let me help. I have a little money saved." Helen hesitated, pride warring with necessity. Finally, she nodded. "I'll pay you back," she insisted. Walking home with the groceries, Helen told him about her dreams for the children. Jenny's artistic talent, Tom's gift for fixing things like his father. "They're smart kids," she said proudly. "They could go to college someday, have better lives than we can give them now." Her voice caught slightly. If only... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Back at the house, as they put away the modest groceries, Ethan watched Helen make soup for dinner, stretching the ingredients as far as they would go. She hummed while she worked, and despite everything, she smiled. The leather notebook felt heavy in Ethan's pocket. These people had so little, yet they shared everything. They faced each day with dignity and grace, helping others even while struggling themselves. He thought about his empty mansion, his lonely life filled with people who only wanted his money. Here, in this run-down farmhouse, he'd found something. His billions couldn't buy genuine kindness, real humanity, but he needed to be completely sure. He would stay a little longer, learn more about this family that had opened their home to a stranger, because if they were truly as genuine as they seemed, he had the power to change everything. The only question was, would money change who they were at heart? That afternoon, Ethan sat on the front porch, fixing the loose railing with tools from David's old toolbox. The school bus rumbled up the dirt road, stopping at the bottom of the hill. Jenny and Tom climbed out, their shoulders slumped. "How was school?" Ethan called out as they trudged up the path. Jenny burst into tears. Tom put an arm around his sister, his face dark with anger. "What happened?" Helen rushed out from the house. "They made fun of my science project," Jenny sobbed. "Said it looked like garbage, and they're right. Everyone else had proper materials from the craft store, and I had to use old string and cardboard." Helen knelt and hugged her daughter. "Oh, sweetheart, and that's not all," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Coach says I can't be on the baseball team anymore. We couldn't afford the uniform and equipment fees." Helen's face crumpled for a moment before she forced a smile. "Come inside. I made cookies. Used the last of the flour, but you both need a treat today." Ethan watched them go inside, his heart heavy. Through the window, he could see Helen comforting her children, making them laugh despite their disappointment. She was amazing at turning their sadness into hope, but he could see how each setback wore on her. Later, while Helen was hanging laundry on the line out back, Jenny brought her drawings out to show Ethan. "These are really good," he said, looking at a detailed sketch of their house. "You have real talent?" "Thanks," she said quietly. "I wish I could take art classes. Sarah Mitchell does, and she's not even that good at drawing. But her parents are rich." Tom was trying to fix the radio again, his fingers nimble with the wires. "It's not fair," he muttered. "We're just as smart, just as good as the other kids. But because we're poor..." "Tom," Helen's voice came sharply from behind them. "We don't talk like that. But Mom, it's true, Dad works harder than anyone, and you never buy anything for yourself, and we still can't afford anything." Helen sat down between her children. "Money isn't everything. We have love. We have each other." "Love doesn't pay for college," Tom said bitterly. "Love doesn't fix the roof or buy food or..." "That's enough." Helen's voice was firm but gentle. "Go wash up for dinner." After the children went inside, Helen stayed on the porch, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she told Ethan. "They're good kids," he said. "They just want more opportunities, don't we all?" she sighed. "Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if we should sell the house, move to the city. But this is our home. The community needs David's help, even if they can't pay much. And the children, they have friends here, roots." The screen door creaked. As David came home, looking tired but satisfied. "Fixed Mrs. Johnson's sink," he announced. "She paid me with a pie." "Apple?" Jenny called hopefully from inside. "Your favorite," David grinned. "And the Petersons gave us some fresh eggs for fixing their fence." Dinner that night was eggs, the last of the bread, and pie for dessert. The children's earlier upset was forgotten, as they enjoyed this simple feast. David told funny stories about his day, making everyone laugh. After dinner, Ethan helped Tom with his math homework, while Jenny showed Helen her new drawings. David went to his workshop, really just a corner of the garage, to repair old Mr. Peterson's lawnmower. "You're good at math," Tom said, surprised. "Where did you learn all this?" "School," Ethan said carefully. "I was lucky enough to get a good education." "I want to be an engineer," Tom confided. "I love fixing things like Dad, but you need college for that, and we can't even afford new school books." Ethan looked at the boy's determined face, so like his father's. The potential was there in both children. They just needed a chance. That night after the children went to bed, Ethan overheard Helen and David talking in the kitchen. "The bank called again," Helen was saying. "They won't extend the loan." "We'll figure something out," David assured her. "We always do. The children need so much. School supplies, clothes, opportunities. Sometimes I feel like we're failing them." "Hey," David's voice was soft. "Look at me. We're giving them what matters most. Love, values, a good example. They're learning that kindness matters more than money, that helping others is more important than having things." "I know," Helen sighed, "but I wish we could give them both." Ethan touched the notebook in his pocket. He'd seen enough. This family had something his money could never buy: real love, genuine kindness, strong values. They helped others even when they had nothing to spare. They faced hardship with dignity and grace. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would reveal everything. But first he had one more test in mind. Because giving money to good people was easy. He needed to be sure they would use it to help others, not just themselves. He needed to know that wealth wouldn't corrupt their beautiful souls. As he lay on the lumpy couch, Ethan smiled in the darkness. He had a plan. And if the Carters responded the way he thought they would, their lives would change forever, and so would the lives of everyone in their struggling community. The night grew quiet except for the crickets outside and the occasional creak of the old house. In this peaceful moment, Ethan realized something profound. He'd come here to test others, but he was the one who had learned the most valuable lesson of all. The next morning, Ethan was up before dawn. He had a plan, but he needed help to make it work. While the family slept, he walked into town and found a payphone near the grocery store. "Margaret." "It's me," he whispered to his secretary. "I need you to do something." An hour later, he was back at the Carter house helping Helen make breakfast. The kids were getting ready for school when there was a knock at the door. A man in an expensive suit stood there, looking important and slightly impatient. Ethan recognized him, James Wheeler, one of his own lawyers, though of course the Carters didn't know that. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" Wheeler asked formally. "I represent the estate of Jonathan Mills." Helen looked confused. "I'm sorry, who?" "The previous owner of the Thompson factory," Wheeler explained, stepping inside. "Before his death last month, Mr. Mills set up a special fund. He felt responsible for the factory's closure and wanted to help one family in the community." David and Helen exchanged glances. The children stopped eating, listening intently. "Your family has been selected," Wheeler continued. "The fund will provide $100,000 to one deserving family, with only one condition. You must use $50,000 to help others in the community. The rest is yours to keep." The kitchen went silent. Ethan watched the family carefully, pretending to be as surprised as they were. $100,000, Helen whispered, sitting down heavily. This can't be real," David said. Wheeler pulled out official-looking papers. "It's very real, Mr. Carter. You can verify everything with the bank. You just need to decide. Do you accept the money and the responsibility that comes with it?" Jenny was jumping up and down with excitement. "We could buy art supplies and fix the roof and—" "Hush, Jenny," Helen said gently. She looked at David. "What do you think?" David ran a hand through his hair. "It's a lot of money and a big responsibility. You have 24 hours to decide," Wheeler said. "I'll return tomorrow morning for your answer." He handed them his card and left. The family sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then they all started talking at once. "We could get new baseball equipment," Tom exclaimed. "And fix your truck, Dad," Jenny added. "The roof needs replacing," David mused. "And the heating system." But Helen was quiet, thinking hard. Finally, she spoke. 50,000 to help others. That's not much when you think about how many people are struggling. Ethan watched her carefully. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. What do you mean, Mom? Tom asked. Well, Helen said slowly, the Wilsons lost their farm last month, and Mrs. Johnson needs surgery she can't afford. The Petersons can't pay their son's college tuition. David nodded. And the community center is falling apart. Kids need a safe place to go after school. Maybe, Helen said thoughtfully, we should use more than 50,000 to help others. We don't need that much for ourselves. But Mom, Tom protested, this is our chance. Our chance to do what? Helen asked gently. To have things? Or to make a real difference? David took her hand. What are you thinking? What if we use 75,000 for the community? We could help more families, maybe even start a fund for college scholarships. The remaining 25,000 would still be more money than we've ever had. Ethan's heart swelled. This was exactly what he'd hoped to hear. We could fix the community center, David said, warming to the idea. Create jobs for people to run it. And start a program to help people learn new skills, Helen added, so they can find better jobs. But what about my art classes? Jenny asked in a small voice. Helen hugged her daughter. Sometimes, honey, helping others feels better than helping ourselves. Remember how good it felt when you gave your old toys to the children's shelter. Jenny thought about it. Could we maybe use some of the money to buy art supplies for all the kids at the community center? I could teach them to draw. That's my girl, David said proudly. Tom was quiet for a moment. And maybe we could start a repair workshop at the community center? Dad could teach people to fix things and I could help. Ethan watched as the family got more and more excited, not about what they could buy for themselves, but about how they could help others. They spent the next hour making lists of people who needed help and ways they could make the money go further. We'll need to be careful, Helen said. Make sure the money really helps people get back on their feet, not just solve temporary problems. We could ask people to volunteer at the community center in exchange for help, David suggested. Give everyone a chance to contribute, keep their dignity. Ethan couldn't stop smiling. The Carters had passed his test better than he could have imagined. They weren't just willing to help others, they were eager to give away most of their windfall to do more good. He touched the leather notebook in his pocket. Tomorrow, when Wheeler returned, he would reveal everything. This family wouldn't just have $100,000 to help their community. They would have billions. But first, he had one more surprise planned. Because if the Carters could do this much good with $100,000, he couldn't wait to see what they would do with real wealth. That afternoon, as he helped David fix a broken window, Ethan looked around at the humble house and the hard-working family inside it. They had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. But more importantly, they had no idea how many lives they were going to change for others. The sun was setting, painting the sky in beautiful colors. Tomorrow would bring the biggest surprise of all. But for now, Ethan was content to watch this. Remarkable family plan. Ways to help others with money they didn't even have yet. He had found exactly what he was looking for. People who saw wealth not as a privilege, but as a responsibility. People who understood that true richness wasn't about having money, but about using it to make a difference in others' lives. That evening, the Carter house was filled with more excitement than it had seen in years. The children were supposed to be doing homework, but they couldn't stop talking about their plans to help the community. We could start a tutoring program, Tom suggested, his math book forgotten. Help kids who are struggling in school. And an art club, Jenny added, drawing pictures of what the renovated community center might look like. Everyone could share supplies. Helen was at the kitchen table with a notebook, trying to make the numbers work. If we're careful with the 75,000, we could help at least 10 families with immediate needs and still have enough to start the community programs. David sat next to her, adding his own ideas. Mr. Peterson knows construction. If we hire him to help fix the community center, that gives him work and he could teach others the trade. Ethan watched them from the living room, pretending to read an old newspaper. His heart felt full in his world of corporate boardrooms and society parties. People talked about money in terms of profit and loss. Here this family saw it only as a way to help others. "John," Helen called out, "would you like to help us plan?" He joined them at the table, looking at their careful notes. They had thought of everything, from emergency funds for medical bills to job training programs. They were even planning to start a community garden where people could grow food to share. "This is amazing," he said honestly, "but aren't you worried about keeping enough for yourselves?" "We've managed this long with almost nothing," David said. 25,000 is more than we've ever had. We can fix the roof, get the kids what they need for school, and help so many others," Helen finished. "That's worth more than any luxury we could buy." Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Everyone froze. "It's too early," Helen whispered. "Mr. Wheeler said he'd come tomorrow." David went to answer it. An elderly woman stood there, trembling and upset. "Mrs. Johnson." Helen rushed to help her. Inside. "What's wrong?" "The bank," Mrs. Johnson sobbed. "They're taking my house after 40 years. My George built that house with his own hands. But the medical bills after his death, I can't make the payments anymore." Ethan watched as the Carters exchanged looks. He knew what they were thinking before they said it. "How much do you need?" Helen asked gently. $3,000, Mrs. Johnson wiped her eyes. "I tried everything, but the bank won't wait any longer. Tomorrow morning?" "Wait here," David said. He took Helen aside, speaking quietly. "We're getting that money tomorrow. We could—" Helen was already nodding. "Mrs. Johnson's house is worth saving. We'll give her $4,000, enough to cover next month too, give her time to figure things out. But that means less for the community center," Tom pointed out, having followed his parents. "This is helping the community," Helen told him. "Mrs. Johnson's house is her whole life. Sometimes helping one person is just as important as helping many." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Even before they had the money, the Carters were already planning how to use it to help others. They didn't even question whether they should wait until the money was officially theirs. "Mr. Wheeler won't be here until morning," David told Mrs. Johnson. "But if you can wait just one more day—" "We're getting some money," Helen explained. "A blessing we never expected, and we want to share it." Mrs. Johnson started crying again, but this time from joy. "You do that? But you need it more than I do. Your roof, the children's school things." "We're all neighbors," David said simply. "We help each other." After Mrs. Johnson left with the promise to return tomorrow, the family went back to their planning. But now they had to adjust their figures, taking into account the money they'd promised to their elderly neighbor. "We can use a little less on the community center renovation," Helen suggested. "Maybe do it in stages. I can help with the work," David added. "Save on labor costs. And I don't really need new baseball equipment," Tom said bravely. "Not right away," Jenny hugged her brother. "We can share my art supplies at the community center. That will save money too." Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stood up suddenly. "I need some air." Outside, under the stars, he pulled out the leather notebook. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. This family deserved everything he could give them, not just for their kindness to him, but for their genuine desire to help others. He heard the screen door open behind him. It was Helen. "Are you all right, John?" she asked. "You seemed upset." "I'm not upset," he said truthfully. "I'm inspired. You could keep all that money for yourselves. No one would blame you after everything you've been through." Helen smiled. "Money isn't worth much if you can't share it. My grandmother used to say that a joy shared is doubled, and a burden shared is halved. Your children are lucky to have parents like you and David." "We're all lucky," Helen said, looking up at the stars. "We have each other, we have our health, and now we have a chance to help others. What more could anyone want?" "About $50 billion, Ethan thought, smiling to himself. Because that's what he was going to give them tomorrow, and after. Seeing how they planned to use 100,000, he couldn't wait to see what they would do with real wealth. Back inside, the family was still making plans. Jenny had drawn pictures of smiling people in front of a bright, renovated community center. Tom was listing all the things he could teach other kids about fixing machines. David and Helen sat close together, their heads bent over their notebook, dreaming of ways to help their neighbors. Ethan watched them, his heart full. In less than 24 hours, he would change their lives forever. But they had already changed his life in ways they couldn't imagine. He had come looking for people worthy of his fortune. He had found something much more valuable, people who understood that true wealth wasn't about having money. It was about having the heart to share it. Dawn broke over the Carter farm with golden light. Nobody had slept much. Excitement and anticipation kept the whole family awake. Helen was up first, making coffee and breakfast despite her nervous energy. "Mom, can I stay home from school today?" Jenny asked, coming into the kitchen still in her pajamas. "I want to be here when Mr. Wheeler comes." "Me too," Tom added right behind her. "Please?" Helen looked at David, who shrugged. "It is a pretty important day," he said. "All right," Helen agreed. "But you both have to promise to catch up on your schoolwork tomorrow." Ethan came in from the porch, where he'd been making a phone call, his final arrangements for the big reveal. His stomach was in knots. In just a few hours, everything would change. "Mrs. Johnson is already here," he announced. "She's waiting in her car at the bottom of the drive." Helen immediately started making an extra plate of breakfast. Poor thing. Probably didn't sleep all night worrying about her house. "David, go invite her in." Soon they were all gathered around the kitchen table. The Carters, Mrs. Johnson, and Ethan. The morning sun streamed through the window, making patterns on the worn tablecloth. "Mr. Wheeler said he'd be here at 9, David said, checking the old clock on the wall for the 10th time. "It was only 7:30. "I still can't believe you're going to help me," Mrs. Johnson said, her eyes wet. "After everything you've been through yourselves, that's exactly why we have to help," Helen said, squeezing the older woman's hand, "because we know how it feels to struggle, and we know how much it means when someone reaches out." Ethan watched them, his heart full. In his pocket, the leather notebook felt heavier than ever. Soon they would all know the truth, not just about who he was, but about how much their kindness had moved him. As they waited, more people started showing up. Word had spread through the small community about the Carters' good fortune and their plans to help others. The Petersons came, bringing fresh eggs as always, but also hope for their son's college dreams. Mr. Wilson from the grocery store stopped by talking about how the community center could help local farmers sell their produce. By 8:30, the small house was full of neighbors, all sharing their ideas and dreams. Nobody was asking for handouts. They all wanted to contribute, to be part of making their community better. "We could start a weekly farmers market," Mr. Peterson suggested. "Give people a chance to sell what they grow. And I could teach cooking classes," Mrs. Wilson added. "Show people how to make healthy meals on a budget." "The teenagers could help with the community garden," another neighbor chimed in. "Give them something productive to do after school." Helen and David tried to explain that they only had $100,000 to work with, but nobody seemed discouraged. They all understood that every little bit helped, that working together could make the money go further. Ethan stood in a corner, watching it all. These people had no idea that in less than an hour, their lives would change forever. The $100,000 that seemed so much to them was just the beginning. At 8:50, a line of black cars appeared on the dirt road leading to the farm. Ethan knew who they were, his lawyers, his accountants, even a few reporters he had carefully chosen to document this moment. "That's not just Mr. Wheeler," Tom said, looking out the window. "Who are all those people?" Ethan took a deep breath. "It was time. Before they come in," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the excited chatter. "There's something I need to tell you all." The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at him, the stranger they had taken in during the storm, the man who had become like family in just a few days. "My name isn't John Smith," he began. Helen's eyes widened. David stood up straighter. The children looked confused. "The truth is," Ethan reached into his pocket for the leather notebook. But before he could finish, the front door opened. James Wheeler stepped in, followed by a team of well-dressed professionals, and behind them came the reporters, their cameras ready. "Mr. Sinclair," Wheeler said formally, "everything is prepared as you requested." A gasp went through the room. Mrs. Johnson dropped her coffee cup. The Petersons grabbed each other's hands. Tom and Jenny looked at each other in confusion. "Sinclair," Helen whispered. "As in Ethan Sinclair? The billionaire?" Ethan nodded slowly. I came here looking for something money couldn't buy. I found it in this house, with this family, in this community. He opened the leather notebook, revealing the documents inside. The $100,000 was just a test, he continued. The real gift is much bigger, because you've proven something incredible, that you see wealth not as a way to help yourselves, but as a way to help others. David was holding Helen's hand so tight his knuckles were white. The room was absolutely silent. I've spent my life surrounded by people who only wanted my money, Ethan said, but you took me in when you thought I had nothing. You shared your last loaf of bread, opened your home, showed me what real kindness looks like. He pulled out the first document from the notebook. So now I'm going to share everything I have with you, and I know you'll use it to change not just your lives, but the lives of everyone in this community. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene as Ethan Sinclair, one of the richest men in the world, prepared to change the lives of every person in that small farmhouse, not because they had asked for it, but because they had proved they deserved it. And it all started with a simple act of kindness during a storm. The farmhouse kitchen had never been so quiet. Everyone stared at Ethan, trying to process what they'd just heard. Helen sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, while David stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. I don't understand, Jenny said in a small voice. You're not really, John? Ethan knelt down to her level. My name is different, but I'm still the same person who helped fix your dad's roof and listened to your stories. That was all real. But you're rich, Tom said, his voice shaking. Really rich. Why did you pretend to be poor? Because I needed to know something important, Ethan explained. I needed to find people who would help others even when they had nothing themselves. Helen found her voice at last. All this time, the test with the $100,000, I wanted to see what you would do with it, Ethan nodded. And you amazed me. Instead of keeping it all, you immediately started planning how to help others. James Wheeler stepped forward with more documents. Mr. Sinclair has already begun the transfer of funds. The initial deposit of $50 million will be available by this afternoon. Mrs. Johnson nearly fainted. Mr. Peterson had to sit down. The room erupted in shocked whispers. 50 million, David whispered. But that's just the beginning, Ethan said. There's more, much more. He turned to address everyone in the room. I've created the Carter Community Foundation with an endowment of $5 billion. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. David's legs seemed to give out and he had to grab the counter for support. The foundation will be run by Helen and David, Ethan continued, because they've proven they know how to use money to help others. Every person in this community will have a chance for a better life. Tom raised his hand shakily like he was in school. Does this mean I can go to college? Ethan smiled. You and Jenny will both have full college funds, and so will every other child in the community who wants to learn. Jenny's eyes were huge. And the art classes? The community center will have the best art program in the state, Ethan promised, along with sports facilities, job training programs, and everything else your parents planned. Mrs. Johnson started, crying. My house is yours, Ethan said gently. Forever. And we'll help you fix it up. Make it as beautiful as it was when your George built it. The reporters were scribbling frantically, cameras flashing. This was the story of the decade, a billionaire who went undercover to find worthy recipients of his fortune. But Helen stood up suddenly. Wait, she said firmly, just wait. Everyone went quiet. Helen walked over to Ethan, looking him straight in the eye. You pretended to be someone else. You tested us. You watched us struggle, knowing you could help at any time. Ethan felt a moment of fear. Had he made a terrible mistake? But then Helen smiled, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing us, really seeing us, not just our problems, but our hearts. She turned to address the room. This money, it's not just a gift, it's a responsibility, and we're going to do right by it. David joined her, putting his arm around her shoulders. We'll help everyone, he said. Not just with handouts, but with opportunities, jobs, education, a chance to build something better. The neighbors started talking all at once, sharing ideas and dreams that suddenly seemed possible. We could bring doctors to town. Maybe start small businesses. Build affordable housing. Create scholarships. Ethan watched with joy as the community he'd grown to love began planning their future. But then he noticed Tom standing alone by the window, looking troubled. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked quietly. "Everything's going to change," Tom said. "Will we have to move to a fancy house? Will people treat us differently? Will Mom and Dad change?" Ethan put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Look at your parents right now." Tom looked. Helen and David were moving through the crowd, listening to everyone's ideas, making sure nobody was left out. They were the same people they'd always been, just with more ability to help others. "Money doesn't change who you are," Ethan said. "It just reveals it. Your parents showed who they are when they had nothing. Having money won't change their hearts." Jenny joined them, clutching her drawing pad. "Can we still live here? I love our house." "That's up to your parents," Ethan said. "But the house does need some repairs." "We could fix it up," Tom said excitedly. "Make it better, but keep it the same too." Helen overheard and came over. "This will always be our home," she said firmly. "We'll fix what needs fixing, but we're not leaving. This is where our story began." David joined them, looking at Ethan with new understanding. "That storm that brought you here, it wasn't really an accident, was it?" Ethan shook his head. "I chose your house because I'd heard about how you help others, even when you can barely help yourselves. But the kindness you showed me, that was all real. Just like the person you showed us was real," Helen said. "Money didn't make you who you are. Your heart did." The morning sun filled the kitchen with golden light. Outside, more neighbors were arriving, drawn by the news spreading through the community. Inside, plans were being made, dreams were taking flight, and hope was blooming like flowers after a storm. "So," David said, looking at the documents Wheeler held, "where do we start?" Ethan smiled. "We start by helping Mrs. Johnson move back into her house. Then we help the Petersons send their son to college. Then we fix the community center. One step at a time, one person at a time, until everyone has a chance at a better life." "Together," Helen said firmly. "We do it together." And in that moment, as the sun shone through the windows of the humble farmhouse, Ethan knew he'd done more than find worthy recipients for his fortune. He'd found a family. He'd found a community. He'd found home. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The Carters' farmhouse became the unofficial headquarters for the community's transformation. Every room was filled with people planning, dreaming, and working together. Helen sat at the kitchen table, now covered with blueprints for the new community center. "It needs to be welcoming," she insisted to the architects. "Not fancy. We want everyone to feel at home here." The old factory building would become something beautiful, a place with classrooms, workshops, art studios, and a medical clinic. But more importantly, it would have a soul. "Look at these," Jenny said proudly, showing her new art supplies to Mrs. Johnson. The old woman had moved back into her house, now secured forever, and came by daily to help with the planning. "Beautiful," Mrs. Johnson smiled. "And you'll teach other children to draw?" "Every Saturday morning," Jenny nodded. "Mom says talents are meant to be shared." In the garage, Tom and David were working with Mr. Peterson, designing the new technical training center. Tom's eyes shone as they discussed the equipment they'd need. "We'll teach people to fix cars, appliances, everything," Tom explained. "Dad says knowing how to fix things gives people independence." Ethan watched it all with joy. He'd moved into the local bed and breakfast, refusing the Carters' invitation to stay with them. "This is your time," he'd said. "I'm just here to help." But Helen wouldn't let him distance himself. "You're family now," she'd insisted, "whether you're a billionaire or not." On this particular morning, Ethan arrived to find Helen making breakfast. For a crowd, just like always, the only difference was that now she had plenty of food to share. "The first scholarships go out today," she told him excitedly. 15 young people from the community will be able to go to college this fall. "Including the Peterson boy?" Ethan asked. "He's already accepted to engineering school," David said proudly. "And Tom's been helping him study for placement tests." The screen door slammed as Jenny ran in. "Mom, The art supplies for the community center are here. And guess what? Sarah Mitchell wants to help teach classes. Sarah Mitchell? Ethan remembered. The rich girl Jenny had mentioned before. The one who took private art lessons. She says she wants to learn from Jenny. Helen smiled. Seems money isn't everything when it comes to talent. Outside, trucks were arriving with materials to repair the Carter's roof. But David had insisted on doing the work himself with help from neighbors. We'll fix up everyone's houses, he'd declared. Teach people the skills while we do it. That way they can help others too. The local newspaper sat on the counter, its headline reading, "Small Town's Miracle, Billionaire's Gift Sparks Community." Renaissance. But the real story wasn't about money, it was about people coming together, sharing their dreams, helping each other. "Mr. Sinclair," a small voice said. It was Tommy Wilson, the grocery store owner's son. "Could you look at something?" The boy held out a business plan, carefully written in pencil. "Dad says the store's been losing money. I thought maybe we could make it better. Make it a real community market?" Ethan sat down with Tommy, reading his ideas. The boy had thought of everything. Local produce sections, cooking classes, even a delivery service for elderly neighbors. "This is brilliant," Ethan said honestly. "Want to present it to the foundation board?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? But I'm just a kid." "So is Jenny," Helen said, joining them. "And she's already changing lives with her art classes." The foundation, the board, led by Helen and David, had made youth involvement a priority. Every project had to include ways for young people to participate and learn. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Helen alone in the kitchen, looking at old family photos. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," she smiled. "Just remembering. My parents worked so hard to keep this farm, to teach us values. I hope they'd be proud of what we're doing." "They'd be proud of who you are," Ethan said. "The money just lets more people see what was always in your heart." Through the window, they could see David teaching a group of teenagers how to measure for roof repairs. Tom was right there with them, explaining tools and safety procedures like a natural teacher. "You know," Helen said thoughtfully, "when you first revealed who you were, I was afraid. Not of the money, but of change. I was worried we'd lose something important. And now I see we haven't lost anything. We've just gained more ways to share what we already had. Love, kindness, community." The afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes in its golden light. Outside, the sound of hammering mixed with laughter and conversation. The house was still humble, but it was full of life and purpose. "Jenny asked me something interesting this morning," Helen said. "She wanted to know if you were lonely, living in that big mansion by yourself." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I was. That's why I went looking for something real." "And did you find it?" He looked around the kitchen, at the blueprints and plans, at the people coming and going, at the love and purpose that filled every corner. "I found more than I ever dreamed of," he said softly. "I found a family." Helen squeezed his hand. "Well, families stick together. So you'd better get used to Sunday dinners here, and holidays and birthdays." Through the screen door they could hear Jenny teaching Sarah Mitchell her drawing techniques. Two girls from different worlds, sharing and learning from each other. In the driveway, Tom was explaining his community workshop plans to a group of interested teenagers. Their eyes shone with possibility and purpose, and everywhere people were working together, planning together, dreaming together. The storm that had brought Ethan to their door had passed long ago, but its effects would ripple through this community, forever touching lives, creating opportunities, building bridges between people. Because sometimes the greatest storms bring the greatest blessings, and sometimes the richest people are the ones who know that true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you share. 1 year later, another storm was brewing over the same countryside, but this time the Carter farmhouse stood strong and weatherproof, its warm lights glowing through the rain. Inside, the kitchen was full of people celebrating Jenny's 13th birthday. The old table had been replaced with a bigger one, but it was still covered with the same checkered tablecloth Helen loved. "Make a wish," Helen said, bringing out a homemade cake decorated with colorful flowers. Jenny looked around at the gathered faces, her family, neighbors, and Ethan, who had become such an important part of their lives. Her art supplies were spread across one corner of the kitchen, where she'd been showing Sarah Mitchell new techniques. "I don't need to wish for anything," Jenny said. "Everything's perfect already." The past year had brought amazing changes to the community. The old factory building had been transformed into a thriving community center, its walls covered with children's artwork, many pieces guided by Jenny's patient teaching. Tom's technical workshop was always busy, with people of all ages learning valuable skills. He and his father had started a program that fixed people's cars and appliances for free, teaching them maintenance skills in the process. The Peterson boy was home from his first semester at engineering school, full of stories about college life. He'd already started a mentoring program for other students who dreamed of higher education. Mrs. Johnson's house was beautiful again, and she hosted weekly dinners for elderly neighbors who once felt isolated and alone. "Remember the night Ethan knocked on our door?" David asked, cutting the cake. "Who would have thought a storm could bring such blessings?" "I knew there was something special about him," Helen said, winking at Ethan. "Even in those wet, ragged clothes," Ethan laughed. "I was terrified you'd recognize me from the business papers." "We were too busy trying to figure out how to feed an extra person," David chuckled. The screen door opened and Mr. Wilson came in, shaking off the rain. "Tommy's idea for the community market is working better than we ever imagined," he announced proudly. "We're now supplying fresh produce to 3 neighboring towns. Indeed, the whole community had bloomed. Every house had been repaired, every family had access to medical care, and every child had educational opportunities. But more importantly, people had hope and purpose." "The foundation got another national award," Tom announced, showing everyone his tablet. "They're calling our community a model for rural revival." "It's not about the money," Helen said firmly. "It's about people helping people. That's what makes it work." Ethan sat quietly watching the scene. His own life had changed, dramatically too. He still ran his companies, but differently now. The Carter's example had taught him to see wealth as a tool for helping others, not just making profits. "You know what's really amazing?" Jenny said, helping her mother serve cake. "Everything we dreamed of doing with that first $100,000. We're doing it all now, but bigger and better." "Because you dreamed big but started small," Ethan said. "You never lost sight of what really matters." The rain grew heavier outside, but nobody noticed. The house was warm with love and laughter. Children ran through the rooms, their voices mixing with adult conversations about community projects and future plans. "I have an announcement," Ethan said, standing up. "The Carter Community Foundation model is being adopted by cities across the country. People everywhere are learning that true community change comes from the heart, not just from money." Helen wiped happy tears from her eyes. "Our little storm refugee turned out to be quite something, didn't he?" "You're the ones who turned out to be something," Ethan corrected. "I just had the good fortune to find you." Through the window they could see the lights of the community center glowing in the distance. Even in the storm, classes and activities were going on. People had a place to go, things to learn, ways to help each other. "This calls for a toast," David said, raising his glass, "to storms that bring strangers to our door, to kindness that changes lives," Helen added. "To dreams that come true," Jenny chimed in. "To family," Ethan said softly. "Both the ones we're born with and the ones we find." As they all raised their glasses, a crack of thunder shook the house. But nobody flinched. Storms weren't scary anymore. They just brought back beautiful memories. Later, as the party wound down and people began heading home with leftovers and hugs, Helen found Ethan on the porch, watching the rain. "A penny for your thoughts," she said, joining him. "I was just thinking about that first night," he replied. "How nervous I was knocking on your door. I had no idea I was about to find everything I'd been searching for. And what was that? Real people, real love, real purpose." He smiled. "You know, I've given away billions of dollars since that night. Started foundations all over the world. But nothing means as much as what happened here. Because it started with a simple act of kindness," Helen said, opening a door to a stranger in a storm. Inside, they could hear Jenny teaching Sarah a new drawing technique, while Tom explained his latest community project ideas to David. The house was full of the same love and warmth it had always had, just with more ability to share it with others. "You know what the best part is?" Helen said thoughtfully. Nothing really changed about who we are. We just have more ways to be ourselves now. Ethan nodded. That's why I chose you. Not because you needed help, but because you knew how to give it. Even when you had nothing. The storm was passing, just like the one that had brought him to their door a year ago. But its effects would continue rippling outward, touching more lives, creating more opportunities, building more bridges between people, because sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as storms. Sometimes the richest people are the ones who know how to share. And sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be given away. As the clouds began to clear and the first stars peeked through, the warm lights of the Carter farmhouse glowed like a beacon in the night. Inside, a family born of blood and choice and love continued planning ways to help others, proving that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in kindness, in generosity, in love. And by that measure, they were the richest family in the world. The end.